Hello, my name is Divya, and for my summative statistics report, I decided to compare the relationship between the number of people who immigrated versus the number of people who emigrated from Canada and the number of people who are employed in Canada between the years of 1990 to 2020. I picked this topic because I myself am an immigrant and I really enjoy seeing how the world develops economically. People generally immigrate to other countries hoping for a better future ahead of them, either through their education, career, or to build a family. Several people immigrate and emigrate in and out of countries yearly, increasing or decreasing a country's population. One of the factors which can affect the economy is the employment rate. In Canada specifically, immigrants contribute to the economy and create jobs for Canadians. And as of 2019, 21.5% of the total Canadian population is actually made up of immigrants with permanent residence. So before starting my research and writing my report, the prediction I made was that there would be a positive correlation between the number of people who immigrated to Canada and the number of people employed in Canada, and that there would be a negative correlation between the number of people who emigrated and the number of people employed in Canada. And I think this makes sense because as a population grows, the demand for employment increases, and also one of the many reasons that people decide to immigrate to countries is to find a better career and for employment. The independent variable for my research data is the number of people in thousands employed in Canada per year, and my two dependent variables were the number of people in thousands who immigrated to Canada per year as my strata 1 variable, and the number of people, again in thousands, who emigrated out of Canada per year as my strata 2 dependent variable. As you can see, the graph that shows the number of people who immigrated into Canada shows a linear distribution pattern while also being slightly skewed to the left. And this can be visually seen as the number of people who are immigrating to Canada is increasing over time. Whereas the second graph that shows the number of people who emigrated to Canada shows a bimodal distribution while also being skewed to the right. When comparing the mean and median values for both variables, they are very different from each other, but relatively the same within the variable. Looking at the graph on the right, the data points are a lot more random than the graph on the left, and therefore it can be concluded that there probably will be some outliers, specifically for the graph on the right. When looking at the standard deviations, they are both very high, and this makes sense because we're looking at a large set of data. But when comparing the two standard deviations, we can see that the standard deviation for the number of people who immigrated is much larger, meaning that the spread of data is greater than the spread of data for the graph on the right. You can see through my box and whisker plot that both strata definitely have some outliers. Even without seeing this data, I would predict that there probably will be some outliers, especially because the number of people who immigrate and emigrate depend on many other external factors as well. For example, in 2020, you can see that there was a drop in both the number of people who emigrated and immigrated. And this was obviously due to the pandemic. And after doing the calculations to figure out if there were outliers, there were outliers in my data. My predictions were actually correct, and seeing my R values, proves my point. The correlation coefficient of the number of people who emigrated out of Canada shows a negative, moderate linear correlation, whereas the correlation coefficient of the number of people who immigrated into Canada shows a strong positive linear correlation. I have come to the conclusion that the relationship between the number of people who immigrate or emigrate to Canada and the number of people employed in Canada show both a cause and effect relationship and a common cause factor relationship. As a country's employment rate increases, the number of immigrants increase, and as the number of immigrants increase, employment rate also increases, and vice versa. And like I said earlier, there are many external factors that can affect both of these variables. For example, like I said earlier, the global pandemic affected the employment rate, the number of people who emigrated and immigrated. So a bias to my data was that when I was researching, some of the data that I found were to the exact number of people, whereas some of the data were rounded. And a limitation to my data was that I had trouble finding data for the number of people who emigrated into Canada between the years of 1990 to 2000. So I did some research and found a formula that I could follow to calculate the number of people who emigrated. And it's also important to note that my report does not account for the people who immigrated to Canada and are unemployed. So the assumption that immigration increases the number of people employed could be less accurate than what is actually shown through my report. And after all my research, it is also false to conclude that immigration solely increases because of the increasing employment rate, because there are many other factors and that also influence the number of people employed. Knowing this information is very important to society, as immigration and emigration happens around us constantly and is a big part of the country we live in. Potential careers that would be interested in the data that I researched would be statisticians, economists, provincial and federal government jobs, as this information can help them know where Canada as a country stands globally, as well as use the data to help make predictions and prepare for future events, using the potential trends that can be found through the statistics of this data. And here are my works cited, and thank you for listening.